I've been reliably informed that if there's a fire, you need to go outdoor. So that's the advice. I'll be going out the window at the same time. The other thing is this event is being live streamed on YouTube. So there will be questions at the end, but be aware you will be live streamed to the viewing public. So do bear that in mind. Delighted to be at Tory conference, which is not necessarily the natural home for a Guardian journalist, although I am a Tottenham fan, so I am used to being around people who are desperately clinging on to the hopes of victory when it doesn't seem altogether likely.
I think there are two of us in the room.
Oh, good, fantastic. So we're at an inflection point for gambling regulation in this country. I think all of us here know that. Seems to have been going on for years. I started writing about the gambling industry in sort of 2016-ish, when the debate was already well underway. And we are long overdue, I think, reform of the 2005 Gambling Act, which came into effect in 2007, as some of you will know, under Tony Blair's Labour government. So there's lots to talk about, lots to discuss. I don't want to occupy too much time, so I think what we're going to do is go through and have the panelists speak for 2 or 3 minutes, and then after that I'll ask 1 or 2 questions and then open the floor up to all of you. So where should we start? Henrietta.
Thank you, Rob. Is this on? Well, that's better. Is it on now? No? The light is showing, but...
You can use mine if you want. Mine's working very well.
Is this better? Yeah. Great. Okay, excuse me, I've written some notes. I'll be less than 5 minutes, but taking into account that being a doctor, I can't read my own writing, so, but my thoughts are clear. So I'll be very optimistic today, and unusually so for me. I do feel that the white paper is a dream come true. After 15 years of campaigning for a change to the then newly implemented 2005 Gambling Act, the 2007 liberalisation of gambling laws created a momentous change in access to gambling at home, when online access was just fully taking off, unfortunately. I opened the first NHS gambling clinic in early 2008, so you can see how we've tracked changes in the population. Our work has witnessed a whole population of gamblers go from almost all land-based to all online. We worked with banks and software makers to help establish gambling blocks, and we saw things go from worse to worse, with the FOBT horrors being a turning point. The idea of finally having DCMS, the HSC and NHS England all in favour of independent and significant funds to address gambling harms has demonstrated how seriously this government has taken on the fight against gambling harms. The levy allows for groundbreaking work, giving us the ability now to plan ahead and put right so many wrongs. I won't go through the wrongs in 5 minutes, but from the lack of significant research to a non-existent prevalence study of quality, to the struggles experienced by treatment providers to be funded adequately, the levy will put a stop to all of the above. And for this, we are truly grateful to the HSC, DCMS and NHS England collaborate, because collaboration is key. My next point is important. The composition of the future levy boards and their ability to maintain a fair and evidence-based system is now vital for the success of the levy's implementation. So for me, the next stage is the most critical. I look forward to continuing in my advisory role with the aim of eradicating all gambling harms and protecting not just the young and vulnerable, but all who gamble and are subjected to gambling exposure. Now we have 15 clinics where we had one, mine, for over a decade being the only one. These clinics cover the whole country. We have imminent NICE guidelines telling us what the evidence base is that works for the benefit of our patients. Things are changing. My last point, I must mention the great work of journalists like Rob at The Guardian and others, particularly at The Times, who have relentlessly driven the need for change. Without them and without lived experience, people such as Gambling with Lies we would not be anywhere close to where we are today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Henrietta. Richard,
Yes.
can we hear from you? Have I surprised you? Have I caught you on the hop?
Yes. No. Fantastic. Look, I'm going to stand up because A, I'm not very tall, so you can all see me, and B, it's an easier way to project a little bit. Look, thank you very much, Rob, for putting this together. Actually, I thought the Guardian started the Manchester. I thought you were the Manchester Guardian.
Absolutely.
So we're coming back to your roots, which is good and proper, and a very distinguished panel. As Henrietta says, actually, when I first visited your clinic, you were the only one in the country. That's it. Now we've got 15 we can go to. And I think, to be honest, at that time, if someone had said to me, we will have 15 clinics in a few years' time, I would have said, I don't think so. So, on this great journey, I really want to start by explaining where I'm sort of coming from. I'm not anti-gambling, but I am very much pro-reform. And the reason I say that is because what I think we've got to avoid is what I call a 17th century style polarization. So stern, puritanical, roundheads, anti-gambling, almost everything, irresponsible, smiling cavaliers, pro whatever you like. And the truth of gambling, as anyone who's an MP and had to deal with the effects of someone who has taken their own lives from gambling, is that there is a lot of stuff that is absolutely fine, and a lot of that is to do with racing, and it would be hypocritical of me to say otherwise, as I've cheerfully lost a few quid most of my life every year at the Cheltenham races. But there are also damaging effects that ruin not just individual lives, but whole families and friendship groups' lives. And that's why the work done by many people on this panel, and perhaps in particular in Parliament by the Gambling Related Harm, APPG, is very precious. In April 2019, I had a 10-minute rule bill, and I called for 5 things, some of which happily have come to pass. First of all was a serious levy on the industry to fund more and important independent research. That is definitely going to happen. It's just about how it happens and how much is raised. And we wait to hear that in the response to the consultation that I think we'll get in October. The second thing I called for was action to protect the young, eliminating gambling advertising. We haven't had an elimination, but we have had a banning on all advertising during live sport and just before and just after, which I'm told by expert analysis, love that phrase, means that 87 or 97% of the amount of TV gambling seen by the young has been eliminated. The third thing, whether that's true or not, Rod shaking said we must come back to that. The third thing I called for was to improve protection for vulnerable, or if you like, problem gamblers. I think the March 20 mandatory setting up of GamStop was a big step forward, and I think around 350,000 individuals have registered for the scheme. That has to be a good start. Whether it's working or not, of course, is the crucial thing. And by the way, on that, we do not know how many people have actually committed suicide from gambling. I know of at least one case where the cause of death was effectively glossed over and excluded. And I suspect anyone who's been dealing with families in those situations would have other examples too. Lastly, then, I called for more gambling clinics, and we've heard that we've gone from 1 to 15, which is definitely good progress. So, in terms of what I and others have been calling for in Parliament on those sort of major headline issues, I think a lot has been done. I think there are good reasons, as Henrietta says, to be optimistic, but the devil is always in the detail. And that's why the response to the consultation following the white paper is going to be important. And I think the key thing is for those of us involved in politics is not to forget about this issue. There are always new issues crowding in on us all the whole time. But this is important. A lot of the people who it affects most are the voices that are often not heard, and we have to speak up. That is ultimately the role of MPs, to be there for the weak and the vulnerable who don't have a strong voice. So I absolutely support work that's being done by the APPG. Very grateful, Rob, that the Guardian is continuing to take a strong interest in this, and let's hope we get a very good, positive response to the consultation.
Thank you, Richard. Ed, is this? That's what great. Thanks for inviting me along. I'm not a policy wonk or a politician or even sort of an expert in the field. Like some people here. So I'm a economist, so my job is to sort of complain about things and come up with useful suggestions. But I'm interested in this in a kind of social history angle. I mean, this is, as mentioned, it's the Guardian. In fact, it was just around the corner when the most infamous massacre in modern British history, the Peterloo Massacre, happened in 1819. After some local businessmen who were non-conformists set up the Manchester Guardian as a result. And the Guardian was always, as the non-conformist was, very critical of the gambling industry and the alcohol industry. And even my parents remember when there was a time when they wouldn't even put race results in the paper. But that seems that kind of non-conformist tradition seems to have completely, I wouldn't say disappeared, it's still kind of, I mean, it kind of exists with rocket. The sort of the critical of the gambling industry, but under Blair, that's all, that's basically liberalised. And when I was growing up, in football, for example, there's almost no gambling advertising, as far as I remember. And now it's everywhere. It's on the shirts, it's on the billboards, it's in the adverts at half-time. It seems to be all-encompassing. And my sort of take from a conservative point is that we are, as humans, we are weak, and a certain portion of us are very vulnerable to certain vices, and alcohol and gambling being the most obvious one. So last night we were coming out here, and there was a girl who passed out drunk, and there's police around her, and she consumed a huge amount of alcohol. But gambling is not so visible. So you don't walk past gambling addicts in the street. Gambling addicts tend to sort of, ruin their own lives and those their families, but we don't sort of see it every day, so it's a much more hidden problem. But then it is still a problem. It comes down to the Pareto principle. The gambling industry makes a huge amount of its money from a very small number of people who gamble heavily. I think it was like 5%, account for 60% of profits. And in that industry, in that sense, it's like the drinks industry, where they still rely on people who sort of overdo it. And I'd also say that technology has kind of basically changed everything. This is the iPhone invented in 2007, around the same time that these kind of laws came in, and the ability to sort of hack our brains and make us far more addicted is just so much more powerful than it was. It's opium to heroin. So I'd say, that's kind of my take, is that because we do have these cognitive biases, we are prone to these kind of problem gambling. Brilliant, thank you so much, Ed. Claire.
Is this on? Yes. No? Good. Hi, so I'm Clare, and I work for an organisation called Tackling Gambling Stigma, which is really about learning from the lived experience of gambling harm in order to bring about change. But today I'm not going to talk directly to lived experience. You can go to our website, and there's lots of recordings of people talking for themselves about what happened and what their experiences were like and what that meant to them and the difference, the change that they want to see. What I want to do in terms of the topic, which is the future of gambling reform, is to talk about what I think we really need to be focusing on, which is how well gambling is functioning as a market. Now, gambling, which is staking something on a chance outcome, is something people do. There's nothing wrong with that. I think what we need to be concerned about is how companies today are selling gambling to consumers, and how this is, and to what extent this is benefiting consumers and economic growth. So fundamentally, gambling companies make money by getting consumers to lose money. So that is the main measure of industry performance. Gross gambling yield is losses from consumers, subtract winnings paid out by operators. Now, companies, they claim that they're providing fun and entertainment in return, but fundamentally their profits come from losses from consumers. Now, since 2016, the percentage of people in Great Britain who participate in gambling has remained around the same. It's 30% if you exclude the national lottery, 40% if you include it. And there's been a steady shift towards remote gambling, but the overall participation is roughly the same. But during this period, we've seen a really dramatic increase in the amount that consumers have lost, right? So from around 8 to 14 billion, largely driven by online and particularly online casinos and particularly online slots. Now, so, you might look at that and go, well, that's creating a huge amount of profit, right? So the gross value add of the gambling industry grew by 45%, while the rest of the economy was just at 80% over that period. So you could say, that's amazing. We've seen really fabulous growth. Alternately, you might ask, how is it that gambling companies are getting around the same number of people participating to lose so much more money? And is that fair to consumers? Is it good for the economy? And we need to think about that in the context of, I think, three main issues. The one that actually gambling, and particularly online gambling, has very low tax and economic multipliers. So consumer spend, put it in just about any other activity, will generate more GVA, more revenue to the exchequer and more jobs. We also need to take into account the socioeconomic costs of harm, which are both to the state, individuals, communities, and society as a whole. And those costs are as yet not comprehensively calculated. So government at the moment cannot actually tell us what the socioeconomic costs of harm from gambling are. And we also need to add in another fact, which is there's a disproportionately, these losses to gambling companies come from the most deprived in our society, right? So if you're thinking just about casino, online casino, 20% of the most deprived areas provide 29% of players and 25% of operator GGY, whereas the 20% least deprived provide 30% of players and 15% of operator GGY. So if you're thinking about this as an industry, as a market, is this really a market that is generating socially responsible growth? And that is doing it in a way that is fair to consumers. And I think while the white paper brings us many great things, I think what it hasn't done is address some of the fundamentals of the market and how it's functioning. So just one thing we've seen in the market is massive consolidation. We've got a few huge global corporate entities who have bought up all the smaller different brands and have got multiple white labels. So what looks like a vast amount of consumer choice is in fact the same big companies selling the same products to people off the back of lots of different marketing brands, and they're competing not on providing a better experience or better entertainment. They're competing based on incentives to gambling. So how much marketing? So they're competing based on marketing and incentivizing gambling. And so what you're seeing is an industry that's no longer delivering sort of casual entertainment, but one that is in fact just getting people to lose more and more money while actually creating more and more harm. And I think that is a failure of the white paper, is to really start to tackle some of those market fundamentals, which is kind of generating these dynamics. And then I think on a linked, the second or the last point, which is kind of linked, is we said the white paper set out to give us gambling reform for a digital age. And I think the question is, has it? And I think particularly if we want to talk about one of the key issues in the kind of digital age, which government has identified across the piece in other markets, which is the issue of data-driven behavioral nudges. So that is the use of consumer data, often aggregated over multiple different places, which gives companies a huge advantage over consumers in terms of what they present to them, how they present it, and the ability to really nudge and push their behavior in ways that are very beneficial to companies, but which consumers aren't really aware of and can't really see. And I just want to quote something from the Digital Advisory Group, which is a group of industry experts advising the Gambling Commission. And they say a whole playbook of techniques have been identified that can be used to get users to engage with mobile apps and web-based products for as long as possible. The risk for online gamblers is clear in our view. If the operators adopt the techniques that have been successfully used by the technology companies and the digital content creators to stimulate engagement and habit-forming gambling apps, there is a substantial risk that they will create a huge cohort of gamblers with a stronger and potentially compulsive gambling habits. This likelihood will be amplified by the easy and anytime gambling opportunity presented by mobile technology. The result could be an epidemic. Now, I think the digital advisory panel could be forgiven for not realizing that all of gambling is effectively based on behavioral nudges. That's the nature of a gambling product. It's about kind of getting people involved and nudging their behavior in various ways. And the gambling industry, long before we had online, were pioneers in the use of data to drive behavior in the design of their products and in the design of their venues. But what we have when gambling has gone online is we have gambling products that are based on habit-forming techniques, embedded within gambling web platforms and apps using habit-forming techniques that are then embedded into wider online platforms and social media, also that use habit-forming techniques. All of this generating data on consumers and their behavior, which gambling companies aggregate and track to create personalized marketing and behavioral nudges tailored to the individual and which adapt based on what they do. And I think that really the white paper is wholly superficial in this area. It kind of says, well, we just don't really know what's going on here and we're not really necessarily going to do anything. They've got some very, very superficial interventions that are really not at all engaging with the problem. And I think, this is not a problem that is unique in gambling. I think it's something that's gambling is grappling with across markets. So I think a key thing for me would be that the Gambling Commission and the Competition and Markets Authority collaborate in really investigating the use of data-driven nudges in the gambling industry and the functioning of the markets. And I think that would be a key next step.
Thank you so much, Claire. It's really interesting stuff on the behavioural nudges. I know when I was researching my book, that was the part that I found the most fascinating once you start to sort of lift that lid. The way that people can be influenced to behave in a certain way by some really smart, but actually in many cases quite simple triggers is really interesting and disturbing in some instances, certainly. So we're going to open things up to a bit of discussion. As we're here at conference, I just want to start by investigating the politics of this a bit, because it's an interesting subject matter, gambling, in that it doesn't break that easily down party lines. You have interesting alliances. If you look on the APPG, you've got it's great. So well, Richard, perhaps you want to start by talking about that. I mean, is there an opportunity here to put some clear water between the Conservative Party and Labour, who've been kind of absent on this issue for some time?
Well, I suppose I'm the wrong person to ask in a way, Rob, because I'm a sort of anti-party politics politician. I believe in alliances across different organisations in order to get the best practical things done, and you do that better, in my view. But I would say this is next step by building partnerships rather than by polarisation. So it goes against the trend, which is increasingly towards the sort of polarisation that historically we saw in the 17th century so disastrously. But actually, if you look at the all-party group, there are some passionate Labour voices that would particularly come from the Swansea area. You've got some very strong Conservative voices. IDS would be a sort of prominent example of that. I'm not quite sure whether the smaller parties have got strong thoughts on this, but I suspect that almost every sensible person, whatever their party political views, could fairly easily agree that we do not want to be a country and society that bans all gambling. We believe that responsible adults should be able to take their own opinions, just as they should be able to decide how much they can responsibly drink. And the Conservative view of that is that it has to be moderated by regulation where that's clearly needed in order to protect people who can't look after themselves effectively. And this is particularly relevant in an age where the marketing of gambling through online means is making it much more prevalent than it was 20 years ago, and means that young people, and Henrietta will be good on sort of giving you better sort of analysis of some of the types who are vulnerable, but I think there is a bit of a theme of particularly young males who are slightly introvert, may be very good at maths and may have good jobs in accounting firms or the rest of it, who do this stuff without anyone else in the family realizing. And then there is a horrible truth to this, and we went through this personally in my family. So I got some first-hand experience as well. And therefore, you do need those reforms. That's why the government was right to react, right to push forward. And we just got to keep holding I think the phrase is their feet to the fire, but it is a rather unpleasant phrase, really, because this is about encouragement, not torture. And so I think that, that should be cross-party. I don't believe that, and I may be wrong, but I don't believe that my party is trying to score political brownie points by saying, we're more concerned about this, or we're doing more on this than a Labour government would do. But I think we recognise that there were some changes made under the previous government that in retrospect weren't that helpful. And if we can help do our bit to try and make things better now, then that has to be good news.
Yeah, I should say I didn't mean to downplay the work of the MP for Swansea East, who, as we all know, is a tremendous campaigner. I'm thinking more at the top of the party, the Labour Party. I feel like there hasn't been sort of vocal support for this issue that perhaps there might have been. On the politics, Henrietta, is it frustrating as someone who's at the coalface and dealing with the ramifications, the fallout of gambling-related harm, that the wheels of politics turn so slowly?
Well, being an optimist, I must admit that even the most extreme optimism that I have demonstrated has been somehow damaged by the slowness with which things have occurred. I would never have dreamt that the last 3 or 4 years would have dragged on so slowly in relation to literally taking care of people whose lives are at risk. We know there are hundreds of people who are taking their lives due to gambling-related suicides. We know that evidence-based treatment is vital. It took a very, very long time to build the capacity for the NHS clinics. There was a point after 10 years when I thought, shall I give up now? No one's listening. And it was only because of my unrelenting optimism that was sort of a slight joke to some colleagues that I kept on long enough until, in fairness, Jeremy Hunt arrived, who took note. So actually, now we're in a good place, but it has been appalling, really, because we had evidence of harm all the way through. And we had evidence of bad behaviour on the part of industry all the way through. We knew suicides were taking place all the way through, but it really needed the APPG and it needed the House of Lords to come together with the most intensely ambitious plans laid out with those 2 reports before we in the NHS could properly do our job being backed by politicians. And it just took a lot longer than we expected. I'm just glad I'm glad I didn't give up. There wouldn't be, 15 clinics now. So.
Question for Clare and then Ed. Some may argue that one of the reasons it's taken so long is a very well-funded and vociferous lobby that works on behalf of the gambling industry. And I know MPs can be touchy about the idea that they're influenced by days out of the races or free tickets to the football or whatever it might be, but the amount that the industry has spent on that kind of thing is huge. I've written about it many times myself. And one of the things that I find quite concerning is that at times we've seen MPs accept hospitality and then, within a matter of hours, turn up in the House and parrot lines that we have seen used by the gambling lobby. Is that something that, working with people who've suffered harm, Clare, is that something that you find difficult to stomach? Is it just, am I being naive? Is this just inevitable in the way our democracy works?
No, I think it definitely is problematic. I think it's problematic both in terms of influence of MPs, but I think we were also concerned with sort of analysing the consultation issued by DCMS on slots, the extent to which that, in fact, advanced what are well-worn industry tropes about sort of consumer freedom. sort of unquantified without thinking about what that really means in the context of an industry that is driving behaviour and which creates harm. And again, advancing claims about the risk of driving people to the black market, which is also well sort of trope. And I think the concern is that these kind of ideas or ways of thinking about the gambling industry continue to make their way into policy, often at the expense of evidence. So there's, in that particular consultation, there's important evidence that's not included, that hasn't been obtained from the gambling industry, and instead the department is advising these tropes for which there is absolutely no evidence. So it's both an overt kind of influence, I think, that might be repaying, giving gifts or whatever to MPs, but there also seems to be an influence in terms of the way that the department still thinks about the issues, which is equally as problematic.
Ed, I'll come to you on this in a minute, but Henrietta, do you want to say something on that subject?
Thank you, Rob. There is something I'm deeply troubled by. Having given, a very brief talk that was very optimistic about where we are and where we're going, I think there is something that is embedded in the current political landscape that does need to change. So at the moment, there are people with significant conflict of interest allowed to stand up and speak within political contexts about things to do with protecting gambling harm, people from gambling harms, about activities to do with gambling, about prevalences and about research to do with gambling. Now, there has to be a way, and I'm not a politician, so it won't be up to me, but there must be a way in which things can be cleaned up within the two houses. And if anyone has been taking money from gambling industry, they should not be listened to by either politicians or the public on any matters pertaining to the safety of the general population. So you've heard me being very optimistic, but I'm deeply troubled by this. And I'm deeply troubled also that I'm not sure this is going to be addressed enough in the next bit of publication, mid-October, when we see what's come out.
Richard, jump in. Sure.
Can I just come back on that? I mean, look, I think if, for example, you live in a city, let's take Stoke, which has got one very big major gambling company, I think headquartered there, and employing lots of people and contributing quite a lot through its charitable wing into the local economy and communities. I think it's understandable that MPs, for example, for that city, will probably not be the strongest campaigners to sort of close down all betting companies. I think everyone has to recognise the contribution locally into the economy and community groups by their major employers. But there is a difference between that and, say, MPs who are taking significant hospitality and then speaking up very strongly in favour of the sector. And I think that's the difference we need to make. But to be optimistic about that, actually none of that has prevented this government, and Henrietta was right to pay tribute to Jeremy Hunt, a very close friend of mine. I didn't want to blow his trump earlier, but I think it's nice that you have. And the government actually has moved forward significantly on this, despite the fact that there are those people who will speak up for the gambling sector in general. And of course, there are others who will speak up, for example, for racing. If you're in a rural constituency with a race course and all the rest of it, that's understandable. So I think that although there's a danger in that, Rob, that's exactly why you and journalists are there to hold us to account, make sure that people are declaring what they need to, and if they don't refer to that in debate, because they should, we all should refer to our declaration of interest, then it's quite right to sort of highlight that and expose it.
I want to move on, but I'll come to you, Ed, on the next subject, which is one of the things that was notable by not complete absence, but it was certainly not at the centre of the white paper, was advertising. And that's something I want to talk a little bit about. I'll give two examples that I find quite sort of personally troubling as a father. One is that for a while I was driving my son to school, so he had to go to a different nursery for various reasons. And at 8 o'clock in the morning or 8:30, whenever it was, there were adverts on the radio for Rainbow Riches Casino. my little boy is 5 years old, sat in the back of the car listening to that, and I've got to explain to him what that's all about. And then another example that people have sent me once or twice through Twitter and other means is at the cinema. You're watching a PG film, and the trailers beforehand, you get an advert for Sky Bet. This has gone too far, isn't it? And it doesn't seem like anything in the white paper is going to do anything about those admittedly niche but quite disturbing examples.
Yeah, I mean, I just find it strange that there isn't, a big moral campaign as there should be against something which is obviously very troubling. I think partly it's just because it's such a private problem for so many people. I don't know the word phrase moral panic, because sometimes you need to panic, but there aren't the kind of spurs to have a panic over something in which the effects are basically sort of kept private within the house. And even the worst outcome with gambling addiction is often suicide, and there are obviously very understandable reasons about reporting suicide and the reasons for suicide. So that doesn't become a spur in the same way that problematic drinking in society or drugs can become a thing. But yeah, I mean, it's kind of dystopian in some of the advertising you see about gambling. I mean, I mentioned football earlier. It's just absolutely everywhere. And there is a kind of like limited amount of, I wouldn't say puritanical, but sort of moralizing the society has. Like, when I was younger, there's smoking advertising everywhere, but I don't think anyone would bring that back. It would just seem really strange.
I think the Institute for Economic Affairs.
Right. Yeah. But I suppose as a society we've probably become more, like Labour particularly, they have a very moralistic urge, but there tend to be about different things, like the isms these days are kind of their moral things. There isn't enough. Maybe there's only a set amount of like moralising anyone can kind of take at one time. It's certainly enough for children as well. It's kind of incredibly bleak when you sort of hear that and see that absolutely everywhere. I mean, on the MPs thing, I don't know the details in particular, but I do think a lot. I mean, gambling for most people is fun and harmless fun for most people. And I think it generally can, a day of the race is probably fun. I'm not sure people need to be sort of, bribed or taken out to sort of believe that. I mean, it's the same thing with telling the kids about why people drink or take drugs. I mean, nobody's denying these things are sort of fun for a lot of people, but there is a minority for which it's completely destructive, and society has a kind of obligation to protect that minority from being exploited by advertising powerful lobby groups. That's my kind of conservative kind of.
Henrietta, you're itching to jump in.
So much. Can I just say one thing? I'm so glad you brought this up. If we end up with an implementation of the white paper and we are still sitting in our cars listening to gambling adverts when kids are being driven to school, we have failed. Because literally we have not properly protected anybody who needs to be protected. And I really mean that. So I hope that something will be addressed in relation to anything that is on radio or TV at any time during the day, because children will see it, and I don't think that's permissible in a society that feels it's looking after its young and vulnerable.
That's actually reminded me of, you were talking earlier about the voluntary ban that the gambling industry placed on advertising during sporting events. One of the things that the gambling lobby says is that reduced the amount that children saw gambling adverts by 97%. That's not right. There are caveats to that for some reason the gambling lobby never puts into these releases when they say this, which is it's released it during the exact period, it's reduced it during the exact period of that ban, right? But it hasn't reduced it by that much overall. Plus, that only applies to television, and our kids looking at television and looking at social media.
Yeah, so that's it. Sorry, that's exactly why I sort of highlighted the expert analysis bit in quotation marks. And of course, the key thing is to have the independent research properly funded by the sector. The independent is the key one, yes, so that we get to the bottom of it. I think Clare was dying to come in.
Thank you. So I think I just wanted to say something about this idea of vulnerability. And I think I would prefer to think about wanting to create a gambling industry where any consumer can take part and be reasonably safe. They can be involved in it, and it's fun, it's entertaining, it's casual substantial fun, genuinely is. And so, in my view, the objective should be to make sure that gambling is reasonably safe for anyone who wants to take part, wherever they take part, in whatever form they take part, not just protecting a group, a specific group that we think of as already vulnerable. And that's because, in fact, there's a very wide range of vulnerabilities, and we can all become vulnerable over time. Right? So, my father might die, and as a consequence of that, I feel terrible. And I've been just doing some, just a little bit of gambling, but as a consequence of that, in fact, my gambling behavior changes. And when you have companies that are behaving in a very exploitative way, it actually becomes very easy to get into difficulty. And that we should think of that as being an issue for anybody who might take part, whether that's your son or daughter or relative who might be taking part. And so I think it's about this idea of making it sort of reasonably safe and a genuine, fun, entertaining industry, not one in which there is always risk, in which anyone who takes part is going to end up in difficulty just because of the nature of the industry as it has developed. And regulation is a key thing to achieve that, right? In some ways you can't blame companies for wanting to make profit, but where the profit comes fundamentally from consumers losing money, then actually you need regulations, that there is a level playing field. Otherwise, if a company wants to introduce kind of lower risk play or market less, in fact, they can't, because they will immediately become uncompetitive to their shareholders. So that you have to level the playing field by having good regulation that applies to all.
Yeah, I think there's something sort of structural at play there, isn't there? One thing that really stuck with me when I was doing the research for my book is someone was talking to me about game design and saying nobody is really out there to say how can I hook someone in, how can I make someone an addict with this slot machine game that I'm developing. What's happening is there maybe 10, 12 game designers are taking their products to a gambling company, they're road testing them, and the one that comes out as the biggest revenue generator is the one that they're going to buy and the one that they're going to promote. And of course, that is likely to be the one that's most dangerous because it's generating greater revenue, it's almost certainly generating greater harm. So that's a sort of a structural question there where nobody is out to hurt people necessarily, but somehow the way that the industry works means that the incentives are there, that the whole industry gravitates towards those more harmful products like online slots, as you mentioned. I'm conscious that we want to open the floor up, so I'm going to ask one more thing before we do. I think, to my mind, the most contentious issue around the white paper, certainly the one that I get the most engagement / abuse around on Twitter and things like that, is affordability checks. This idea that if you spend a certain amount, you lose a certain amount, gambling operators will be required to see your pay slips or see your bank statements and find out if you can afford it. There's a sort of fundamental question here, isn't there, around civil liberties and what is too intrusive? Why should the government be allowed to tell you how to spend your money? I'd be interested in everybody's take on that before we open the floor. Ed, should we start with you?
I mean, yes, in theory, I'm against considerability grounds, but a lot of these things, the technology is new. This is like 15 years old technology. We've never dealt with this kind of the ability of the algorithm or designers to hook people into something that's vulnerable is new. And unfortunately, over the last, I'm going to sound like such a sort of anti-authoritarianism here, but lots of these kind of challenges of the internet do mean that we do have to lose a bit of civility if it involves something like propaganda. There can't be a situation where someone is allowed to continuously blow huge amounts of their money online without there being some kind of check. So I think probably would be a favourite.
Henrietta, what's your view on the civil liberties argument?
Well, having spent the last 25 years working in addictions, I would say that I have no doubt that this is a good thing to implement. What we need to do is to make sure that the privacy side of things is clear so people feel they can trust it. But certainly it would avoid a significant number of deaths, broken families, families moving to in wrong, different areas because they've lost everything. There are so many positives. If you think that we have thousands of people coming through the system for gambling harms, and they're even just a small percentage of people suffering financial harm due to gambling disorder and just gambling problems in general. Having those checks would allow for a reduction, if not a total elimination of those harms.
Richard.
Yeah, no, I'm very split on this, Rob, because on the one hand, I have a constituent who was a taxi driver who ran up debts of over £100,000, and it's pretty obvious that he didn't have the money to remotely afford that. It cost him his marriage, his job, very nearly his life, but he has sort of recovered from that, which is an example of great resilience. So in that case, I would probably be with Henrietta on that side of the argument. However, on the other side of the fence, there are people who say to me that they can't go and make a decent sized bet at the races in Cheltenham without somebody saying, can I have a complete list of your sort of assets and financial work? When my wife and I both had an account with Nationwide with a combined total of about 350 quid in it, we got a politically exposed persons questionnaire asking us to list every financial asset we had or had ever had, in sort of 7 or 8 page document. And we just looked at this and we said, well, that's it, we just close the account. And so I think the danger of sort of regulation, comparing two things that are rather different, is that you create something in the case of the Nationwide thing about politically exposed persons, which led to massive sort of overkill. And I think we're at risk of doing the same thing on listing assets and financial worth in order to achieve a laudable game, which is to try and understand whether it is likely that someone who is putting a big bet on has actually got the money to be able to afford it, or whether that's going to lead to massive stress and then the problems which the gambling clinics have to try and sort out. So I think there's a real danger in actually doing something which, on the civil liberties side, is unacceptable to a great deal of people. And I hope, again, we can somehow navigate between that to make sure the gambling companies do look more into what their clients are doing, do understand their clients. It used to be what was called KYC in the financial industry, know your client, so that they don't do something that's obviously crazy.
Yeah, I think the Gambling Commission says at the moment that such checks would affect 0.3% of accounts. I think it's difficult to quantify that because accounts is not the same as people. People have multiple accounts, so it is a tricky one to say exactly where that would land. Claire.
So I think that there's a certain amount of hypocrisy coming from the gambling companies that is stirring this debate, in that they are kind of saying, oh no, we're going to have to make checks on people and it's going to deter people and infringing civil liberties, etc. They already have been making very similar checks for a long period of time. So when I signed up, I'm researching bingo operators, and when I signed up for a variety of bingo companies some time ago, in fact, I had to give them permission to do a soft credit check. And that was just in the long terms and conditions, which I'm sure most people don't read. And the affordability checks, in some respects, are just saying that instead of doing that in order to profile your customers, in order to see how much profit you can get out of them, you need to do it in order to keep them safe. So I think the bigger issue is kind of the use of data in ways that we as consumers really aren't aware of and don't really have control over anymore, which is not just an issue for the gambling industry, it's an issue across the piece. And I think just the other thing, I think it's a kind of a strange irony to me that a conservative government has kind of chosen this as its kind of reform, which it does feel quite invasive of kind of civil liberties and kind of gives more power to gambling companies to kind of survey people and combine data on them and figure out who they are and what they can do. But it seems that kind of has been chosen over doing more fundamental things to address the market dynamics. And I think that's a really a big missed opportunity. So instead of focusing on these checks on individuals, doing some things to address the market dynamics underneath that we were talking about, I think that's really where the focus should be.
I would say, you mentioned there's hypocrisy in the industry. I would say the biggest single indicator of whether you're going to be allowed to bet or not is not whether or not you can afford it, it's whether you've shown any history of winning, at which point you'll be shut right down very quickly. I've written extensively on this. Yeah, it's called stake factoring. If you show that you can beat the odds regularly, they simply dial down the percentage that you can bet relative to the percentage that an ordinary customer can bet until you can't get on anymore. And one interesting, sorry, I'm rambling, but it's a pet subject of mine. One interesting point is they won't dial you down to zero because they want to see what you're betting on so that they can follow it. So they'll dial you down sort of 0.1% of what other people can bet. Let's open the floor to questions. My, all right. Yes.
Thank you, Rob. I'm Sally Osmond from Gambleware, and I'll start with the sharing optimism, the initial optimism that Henrietta outlined, because we all welcome the white paper, we welcome the intent of it, we absolutely welcome the biggest thing for us in particular in this, which is the move to statutory again, presents everybody an opportunity to work towards more cohesive national strategy. I just two points really. It goes back to this. Yes, it's a cross-party issue, which is encouraging. However, we are concerned about the time frame. Our real focus at the moment is about maintaining and focusing on service users at the moment. Our concern is that this moves much further back. It gets tangled up in an election, it gets pushed even further into the long grass. And whilst it's great to have 15 clinics with the NHC, which is wonderful, it's also a health and developed nation. There are also concerns about Scotland and Wales. It's also a society issue, it's not just an medical one. And we're dealing in an environment with a health and inequalities agenda, which is equity in groups, and also the cost of living crisis that's only going to exacerbate that. So my question is sort of twofold. One is the fact that actually we need to, in the interim, focus on protecting individuals. It's also an issue that affects others, so it's much wider than just those impacted. And therefore, we need to make sure that the voluntary sector works as tightly as possible with the statutory sector. So my question is twofold. First, what can be done to make sure that this actually, the statutory instrument gets put into the calendar, the parliamentary calendar for next year, on the basis that a levy consultation will start in October. And secondly, what else can be done to protect service users in the interim and make sure the voluntary sector and the statutory sector work closely together?
Richard, let's start with you with the parliamentary timetable.
Okay, I mean, I think those are all really, sensible points, particularly about the timing of things and so on. All I can say is that I will try and do my best to encourage it. I'm sure the APPG will take the same view. I think probably the political reality is that if the statutory instrument proposed has got anything in there that is going to provoke a very strong backlash from people who would normally be happy to move with reform, but not happy to get lots of emails from their constituents saying what you're proposing to do is very bad news for them, I'm thinking of civil liberties in particular, then I think it gets more complicated. And any government's natural instinct at that stage would be to, okay, well, if we can't move forward on this as fast as we would like. So that's where I think the government will have to move astutely in trying to carry as many people with it as possible. And that will probably mean that there will be some people who will be disappointed about not implementing everything that perhaps all of us would like to see happen. But I think that is in the nature of politics. It's the art of the possible. And we probably all agree that to see some movement forward would be better than trying to push for everything and ending up with it going into the long grass before the election.
What about protecting people in the meantime, Henrietta?
Thank you for raising the issue, actually, because in my enthusiasm, I did not mention that the NHS is indeed providing and will, even with its expansion to 3,000 people a year, will only be providing a small proportion of what will be the patient load across the whole country. And so we are very excited about working through a levy-funded treatment system across the 15 clinics. Each NHS clinic will work with a lot of different providers currently funded through Gamble Aware, and we can't wait to get started really and set up the most evidence-based system that has ever been seen anywhere in the world really. I don't mind saying that. I believe we are there almost. So, yeah.
How busy are the new clinics, by the way?
Well, they're building capacity, they're very busy. We are opening the last one, 15th, sometime around October in Sheffield, so things are going well. The idea is really to double capacity by the end of 2024, ending up with 3,000 episodes. And if you think that until very recently it was just my clinic, it is pretty good go. Yeah.
Anyone else on the panel want to answer that, or should we move on to the next question? Yes. All right, so one just there, please.
Fundamentally, I think what gambling is value tracking prices.
Could you speak up a little? We're struggling to hear you.
On gambling is value tracking prices. So the money that you've got you have dividends or capital corporations or other people's bridging business. Given that this happens, really small from there, is it right to recommend that both ones very wrong on private the toes, and would it be better if we have more community or government enterprises which remove that profit motive and probably prioritise well-being whilst reinvesting services in either social or charitable causes? So basically bring back to make or how we
privatising the tote, and I guess we could expand that into more broadly state involvement in this sector. I mean, if you look at other countries, you have state monopolies in some countries. Finland, until very recently, was a state monopoly. I know France, I think, in the not too distant past, was more or less a state monopoly. I know China is as well, but that's for slightly different reasons. What do you think, Richard?
Look, I'm not really big on state-owned enterprise monopolies. I've lived in a bundle of different regimes in my life, including in China, and on the whole, they're not sort of fabulously well run, and they're not, as a general rule, run in the interests of the people, especially if that regime has got sort of people's democratic something attached to it. So the business of profits is an interesting one to raise at a Conservative Party conference. Look, I have a real philosophical problem with this. The object of every enterprise under the sun, whether it's a mutual, a charity, or a limited company, should be to make money. If they don't make money, they go bust and they disappear, or they fall back on taxpayers to sort them out. The advantages of mutuals or charities is that the money doesn't go out in dividends to the shareholders, it gets reinvested in the cause, and that's perfectly legitimate. But let's forget that actually dividends also are what supply our pensioners with an income, so there is a social benefit to that as well. And if we allow businesses to be legal, which we do at the moment in the case of gambling companies, then to have listed companies that make profits and fund pensions and so on is not illegal, and it's not an evil in itself. And I do think that at this conference of all, we should be very clear on that.
I tend to think Conservatives that the state runs things quite badly, so I'd be in favour of that. They're probably running really badly.
There'd be fewer gambling, is that what you're saying? Fine. Back right.
Hi, I'm Joshua from the charity Irish Prevention of Suicide. Now, obviously, suicide has been spoken about, but then we talk about young suicide specific to any fault in that particular. We know young people are gambling, both those under 35, where suicide is killer, and also those under 18, a variety of ways. Do you think that gambling awareness has a role in education? Should we feel the national group to some extent, and if so, how would you do that?
Who wants to jump in? Claire?
So I could just repeat that last
They
one.
want it on national education.
But if I'm right, it has just been incorporated into the PHSE document, at least in England. Sorry, I was very much still thinking about this issue about profits from the gambling industry.
That's quite all right. I can pass it on to someone.
So my mind was very much preoccupied with that, and I don't think anyone is saying that gambling companies shouldn't be allowed to make money, right? That's the nature of enterprise. I think the issue is the extent to which they do that and the extent to which that is actually socially responsible growth that is contributing to a fair and prosperous economy, right? Or whether it's actually just extractive, it's going out, it's going into multinational pockets, it's coming out of communities, so it's actually not really generating economic growth of the kind that we would like to see, and particularly where it's coming out of the most deprived in our society, right? And therefore just creating more burden for all of us. That doesn't seem to make sense. So, sorry, that was very much on my mind. I wasn't probably paying.
Well, I'll make a point while perhaps panelists think about the education question. Something that occurs to me quite often, I think, is underappreciated, which is that the Gambling Act came into force in 2007. So the generation that have grown up in the society shaped by that act are really only turning 18 now. I think there's sometimes a belief that we've seen the cultural change that act brought, and I don't think we have, because I think these things they shape how we grow up. They shape us as children. If you're surrounded by gambling imagery, you're seeing the odds on television, you're recognizing the brands, that has an effect, and it plays out quite slowly. So I think that's one reason to sort of generally be quite cautious and err on the side of caution when it comes to gambling, because I think we really haven't seen the effects of that cultural change filter through generationally just yet. Henrietta, on education.
Some of you know that I set up and run the young people services from age 13 upwards. Sometimes, very sadly, the young person is younger than 13. And when we see them, often what's happened is there's been a terrible disaster. They've gambled money that is not theirs. It belongs to their parents, on credit cards they've taken, on cards they've taken. I know that there are many educational programs around the country that are addressing gambling. My concerns are strong in relation to the fact that not all of them are in unison. They're not all addressing gambling disorder in the same way, the way that is evidence-based. So I'm very clear that with the introduction of the levy, we will absolutely address education, and there will need to be a very clear approach to addressing the harms and making sure there are ways for children and young people to come forward if they feel they're doing things that no one knows about, because often that is the issue that we see at the clinic. They arrive very late when they've already lost a lot of money or they're suicidal. So I think there needs to be a national approach to the educational side. It has to be absolutely independent of industry. I know for a fact at the moment there are people using industry money to do educational stuff around the country. I think it's scandalous, really, and that's one of the things that I have spoken about before. That needs to change.
Richard.
Yeah, just a quick comment, really. I think there are two different things. One is sort of general education and awareness, and the other one is sort of putting it on schools' curriculum and stuff. And I think there is a danger in trying to load too much onto a school's curriculum. Talk to any teachers about this. More and more stuff keeps being lobbed in. I think it's very important that they keep doing what they're good at doing, which is focusing on values, and that is the best way for small children to focus on. I think there is a case for whether there should be something a bit more at universities to deal with this, because I think that's where a lot of problems happen, is people often leaving home for the first time, going off to university, not knowing many people there, feeling a bit out of it, maybe not that cool, sitting in their rooms and starting to gamble. And the sort of mentoring that's going on in some universities, I think that we're going to need more on that as a result of it. Suicide has definitely risen in universities. So there is a challenge around there. But in terms of the general education point, which should, I think, be included in the levy, yes, I think we would all agree on that. But I think identifying where the biggest risks are and then focusing on them, and in my view, that's at university, is probably the way to tackle it.
Yeah, that's a good point about university. And actually, people at university are not included in the NHS health survey that measures problem gambling. In the same way, also, the homeless are not included. People in institutions are not included. In fact, quite a large cohort where problem gambling is statistically higher than in the general population are not included in those figures. Has anyone else got anything that they want to add on that particular point? Otherwise, I think we'll wrap up. And there are no more questions, were there?
If there were any questions that weren't
Yeah.
able to be asked or answered, maybe they could just follow any of us.
That's a good idea. Do come and see us afterwards if there's anything you want to talk about. All right, thank you everybody. Thank you to the panelists joining us, and yeah, enjoy conference.